It's Wednesday lunchtime that we're recording this, Wednesday lunchtime in the UK, and we are already in this week into a pretty serious week of military news, with the news that American long-range missiles are now being used into Russia, British long-range missiles as well, and the safety of the world is on everyone's agenda, and of course is on the agenda of the incoming Trump administration. So, two questions. Number one, how does Donald Trump intend to keep us safe? And number two, does he have the people at his disposal and the policies at his disposal to do that? Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Justin, back at home in South London.
And it is Mariana, aka Misinformation, alone in the worldwide headquarters of Americast.
And before we get to defence matters, it's worth saying that the wider Trump cabinet is beginning to take shape. Linda McMahon will be known to wrestling fans around the world. She's the co-founder of the World Wrestling Federation, which is now, I am told, World Wrestling Entertainment, because I'm not, I have to confess,
a wrestling fan.
But there you go, that's a surprise. But she's been chosen as Education Secretary, Mariana, so there you are. She brings something interesting to the job.
New to that arena, yeah. And then there's other news. Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, people might know, a celebrity doctor, a TV host, has been chosen to lead the Centres for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Perhaps not that much of a surprise in that he's quite aligned with someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been the pick for Health Secretary. He's also been embroiled in a fair bit of controversy. You might remember during the pandemic, he was keen on using hydroxychloroquine, if I'm saying that right, to try and treat COVID, which was contrary to a lot of the scientific advice. I can't say anything now.
You managed hydroxychloroquine, but not contrary. I know exactly where that's from. You concentrate hugely on one word and then all the others go to pot. But I'm very impressed that you managed the first one.
Well, a few things about vaccines as well that he said are kind of similar to, again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., just stuff that puts him in the vaccine skeptic camp sometimes, and which has fanned the flame of some more extreme anti-vax ideas, but perhaps that he himself hasn't actually said. So again, a kind of interesting pick. As we've now realised, Trump's strategy, a very kind of controversial, let's mix things up and go against the grain type decision.
And he's obsessed with television, and there's no question about that. So we're going to talk in a bit about Pete Hegseth, this defence secretary pick, who is a decorated military officer, fought in Afghanistan. I mean, he's no slouch when it comes to soldiering, but he doesn't have any national security experience. And he's been most recently employed as a Fox News person. So there you are, back onto the
cabinet.
TV. Yeah. It's always the TV. And this fascinating thing, Marianne, I don't know if you saw that Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. So these are two people who are not very well known outside the United States, but inside the US, because of their program, which is called Morning Joe, this very left-wing morning program that was Joe Biden's favorite program. And they've been going on and on about how Trump is a threat to democracy. And they've just gone down for a summit, would you believe, in Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump to kind of patch things up, it seems. And again, you think, why on earth would he bother with them? He won the election, except that he does have this sort of weird interest in TV and TV people, even if they say foul things about him.
And also, after everything we've spoken about over the past few weeks in terms of how, the rise of alternative media and perhaps the decline of traditional TV, it's kind of ironic and a bit funny that it's the traditional TV people that are still very much, it feels like, the go-to for Donald Trump when he's figuring out what to do in these circumstances.
Yeah. We should talk a little bit about the military side of things before we get into our interview, because, number one, plainly, we live in very serious times and potentially very dangerous times. But number two, there is this sort of sense, isn't there, about the Trump administration. We really felt this when we were in the US earlier in the year. I'm thinking right back at the beginning of the year. That people used to say to us, I think I remember being with you when someone said this, that the thing is about Donald Trump, he'll keep us safe because he kept us safe during his first administration. And we've had people on like Christiane Amanpour from CNN, who you remember told us that's just luck. I mean, it wasn't any skill on his part. In fact, he behaved very dangerously. But it's that sort of sense now. The American people are going to be looking, aren't they, at Donald Trump and saying, OK, follow through on this then. We need safety. And the question that I'm going to have is whether that safety means pulling back from the world Is that what the American people want? Or is it, use of deterrence, that more kind of conventional way in which in the olden days they would have said that they're keeping America safe?
Yeah, and it's kind of for that reason that there's no better person to talk to really than Robert Wilkie, who is someone who is kind of there, like on the inside, thinking about all of the decisions that go into exactly like you described, Justin, that kind of push and pull of how do we get involved, do we back away? He's someone who's trained as a lawyer. He's served in the Navy Reserve and has held various kind of important positions, including under Bush's administration. So it'd be interesting to see kind of what he has to say about where this is all headed, particularly in light of what Joe Biden's been up to as well.
Well, let's get straight to him because he's on the line now. Robert Wilkie, who is Director of Defense Transition for Donald Trump, and is on the line now. And I suppose the first question, Mr. Wilkie, number one, thanks very much for joining us. Number two, what do you do? What does the job involve?
So I'm in charge of policy. Under American law, once a president-elect is chosen, and when I say president-elect, not the legal sense that the Congress has certified it, but the one who is acknowledged to have won the election, then several laws kick in. There begins a legal period of transition in which communications are begun with the incoming administration and the outgoing administration. Policies are developed so that on day one, there will be a policy plan to be implemented. So this is the roadmap on how the Pentagon should operate for the next 4 years.
Give us a sense of what we should believe is the kind of coherent philosophy when it comes to the use or non-use of military action around the world of the incoming administration. I'm thinking of the Secretary of Defense, but also more widely as well. What is the thing that guides you?
If you go back to the first Trump administration, and I agree with you that it's very easy to be caught up in the ephemera of American politics, particularly in the persona of President Trump. But if you look back, the one time that Putin got out of hand, his troops got too close to American troops in the Syrian desert, 300 of his troops were killed. When Iran started to flex its muscles through its proxies, Soleimani was killed. I think it is incumbent upon the new administration to restore morale amongst the armed forces and to restore that sense of purpose. Not belligerency, but the use of the military to prevent wars, to deter wars, which is something that we saw made manifest in the first 4 years that Donald Trump was in office.
But that's going to surprise a lot of people, what you've just said. And I want to pick it up, if I may, because I think the way that Donald Trump's administration and plans have been characterized, and in part because of the things that he's said and his supporters have said. You think of the things J.D. Vance used to say about Ukraine not being a kind of central issue for people where he came from. I think we've all talked ourselves into thinking that this is going to be an isolationist administration, even a pullback administration. And what you seem to be saying is actually, no, that's not the case at all.
So let me, and I'm not speaking officially for Mr. Trump, but I can paint a picture as to how this might play out for the Ukrainians. I do think that on day one, the call will go to Putin to stop. And to Zelensky, we really need to think about stopping this. Now, look, as a military person, I look at this conflict and say that both sides are losing. The one thing that I think the Russians had better watch out for, though, is if they approach any negotiations in the traditional Russian way of trying to bully the opponent and make broad pronouncements about a devastating Russian response. I can't think of anything that would trigger a forceful response from Donald Trump more than that. If the traditional Russian way of negotiation is pulled on Trump, I think you will see more support for Ukraine than has otherwise been evidenced.
You've spoken quite a lot about policy there, and you've mentioned how that's your focus. Obviously, there's also been quite a lot of discussion about personnel and very specifically about Pete Hegseth and the decision to put him forward as Defence Secretary. What did you make of that?
Yeah, well, it's a typical Donald Trump focus on disrupting the status quo, and we see that with picks across the incoming administration. You put a
Because
soldier in.
he doesn't have national security experience in
Right,
a way that you might expect. There's also
right.
various accusations. For example, that he paid a woman who accused him of sexual assault to stay quiet, so to not risk losing his job at Fox. He denies that's the case. But why choose someone like that?
Let me speak to your first point about. I think you're discussing experience. The current Secretary of Defense, I've known him since I was 10. He worked for my father in the 82nd Airborne Division in the 1970s. He has enormous experience. He commanded the crown jewel of America's Army combat power, the 18th Airborne Corps, which consists of our two most decorated military divisions, Army divisions, the 82nd Airborne, and the 101st Airborne Division, four-star general, combatant commander. And I don't know that anyone in the national security world would argue that under Secretary Austin, the Pentagon has been run well. There has been no steady application of American power. There's been no attempt to bring the acquisition and budget process of the Pentagon into the 21st century. So experience can cut both ways. I think what President Trump is aiming for is someone who speaks to the troops, someone who speaks to restoring morale, not only amongst troops, but amongst those families who traditionally have sent their young people to serve in the armed forces. And I'll give you an example. The all-volunteer force was created by Richard Nixon in 1973. Under Joe Biden, we have seen the lowest recruiting numbers in 50 years since that force was created. And the traditional reservoirs of American military recruitment have been drying up. The other thing that this administration did in the name of diversity, it said publicly that it did not want second and third generation recruits in the armed forces of the United States. The Secretary of the Army testified under oath to that. Now, she doesn't know her own force. 79% of the soldiers in the Army of the United States come from Army families. So to wage war against that cohort is to actually put you on the road to destroying the force.
Let me, though, put to you what militaries, and it's not just the Pentagon and the Pentagon under Biden, but also to an extent the Ministry of Defence here in Britain and other armies around the world, around the Western world, say about DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. They say, look, we live in an increasingly complex world. We've got a huge array of problems. We need to get talent from where it is, and we need a broad range of experience and attitudes in the modern world. And that is the defence, isn't it, of DEI, of diversity and inclusion. This kind of sense that if you don't do it, and you might take a temporary hit, perhaps, in terms of ability to do press-ups or whatever it is. But actually, if you don't do it, you're not a serious army in the modern world. Is that something let me ask you if in any sense at all, you accept that?
No. And I'm going to just be blunt. This primarily is coming from nations that have not fought or won a major conflict in hundreds of years. The American military is probably the finest mirror of what American society looks like, of any element in our nation. The other thing I will say about what they've done with DE&I, they have separated our forces into sexual, ethnic, and racial categories. They have been engaged in the indoctrination of those DEI principles that tend to divide us. And I always say this: the armed forces is like professional sports. If you perform, you're accepted. It doesn't matter what the force looks like.
Robert, in terms of what you're describing sort of in practice, I mean, there's been quite a lot of speculation about sackings,
Yeah.
changes to how all this stuff could work. I mean, we on Americast have spoken quite a lot about more generally kind of Elon Musk and this idea of the Department of Government Efficiency. How does that kind of thing work in this space when it comes to the military?
Yeah.
Like, are there going to be generals that are sacked? For example, Charles Q. Brown Jr. and various kind of speculation about that happening. What do you think?
Well, I can't speak to any particulars because I'm not privy to what the president is thinking along those lines. But let me just answer the first part of your question. When the United States military has about 2 million under arms, 700,000 civilians. We have more generals and admirals today with 2 million under arms than we did when Japan surrendered in 1945, when we had 16 million in uniform. We have a top-heavy bureaucracy in the Pentagon. We have redundant staffs. We have staffs that the only thing they seem to do is grow in numbers without a corresponding increase in production. What I think Mr. Musk will look at, and what I would certainly look at if I were at the Pentagon, is how do we get these staffs under control and get these people in uniform back out into the field.
Just to go back to what Mariana was saying about General Brown, and I know you don't want to and you can't talk about it individuals, but I think the suspicion, I mean, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the suspicion is, and has been, that what Donald Trump is about is getting top military officers fired, and this is the crucial bit, replacing them with loyalists to him rather than the Constitution. In other words, he creates a kind of Praetorian Guard and then possibly uses the military within the United States. Is all of that, in your view, totally outlandish?
I think that is more hyperbole, and let me just address that. The American military, unlike in its traditions, unlike the traditions in your country, the American military has never sworn an oath to an individual. It has always sworn an oath to a piece of paper and a concept, the Constitution.
And that still will be the case.
And that has to be the case. I will tell you, and I haven't checked this statement with anybody, I'm offended when I see scores of retired generals and admirals making political statements. And it doesn't matter if they're for conservative candidates or liberal candidates. I think that's at war with the traditional American military ethic. And what I saw with Biden and Obama, but particularly Biden, was they were having their generals make very, very harsh statements about the political affairs of the nation. I can't tell you what I felt when the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs was in front of the House Armed Services Committee talking about Black Lives Matter, which was one of the most divisive issues of that particular period in American history, and talking about white supremacy. He has no remit to talk about that. And it was not just him, it was several of the others. So I would argue that we've seen that dangerous door open. And what we need to get back to is promoting combat-ready officers.
Just to get your view on some of the other views of the people who look like they're going to be making up Donald Trump's administration when it comes to some of the issues we've been talking about, the war in Ukraine, for example. Tulsi Gabbard tweeted in February of 2022, so a couple of years ago now, this war and suffering could easily have been avoided if Biden administration and NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO, which would mean US NATO forces right on Russia's border. And Tulsi Gabbard is obviously Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. What did you make of those kind of comments?
Well, certainly, I mean, they're not members of NATO, and they weren't. But I don't want to comment on the particulars of some of these statements, but let me just point you to the other side. You have in the nominee for the Secretary of State someone whose views on Eastern Europe are, I think, completely in line with what you see coming out of Downing Street. As we mentioned earlier, Donald Trump was not easy on Vladimir Putin. I mean, he essentially bankrupted his country. And what you will see, I think, on day one will be an order to open up all of the spigots on American energy production. And that is the one thing that will, in addition to Putin wasting his money in Ukraine, that's going to put a clamp on the Russian economy, as it will put a clamp on the Iranian economy.
Thank you so much for all of this. We sort of really appreciate it, and kind of all the particularly kind of insider insights you're able to give us. And on a completely different topic and note, mainly just because I love football, but I'm quite a fan of your Arsenal mug, which I believe is nearby. Why are you an Arsenal fan?
My father spent many years of his career. He was actually badly wounded in the invasion of Cambodia, and the army said, "Go to the UK and teach." His first stop was at the Royal Regiment of Artillery, the Royal School of Artillery, Larkhill Camp in Wiltshire. The Arsenal Football Club in the 1880s was actually created by 11 members of the regiment who decided to get out of Victoria's service and join what was then emerging as the world's really first professional sports league, the Football League. And as a child, when the regimental day occurred, the Arsenal team, which at that time, sorry to you Spurs fans, the 1971 team was the double winning team. One of three Arsenal have, much more than Spurs. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the game. I fell in love with its traditions.
Do you think Arsenal will win the league this season?
Boy, it's tough. If these injuries, if Rice is not healthy, if Odegaard's not healthy.
By the way, Justin has no idea what's going on, by the way. He's thinking, how have we gone from talking about the military to this?
I'm thinking two things, Robert. One, I'm thinking you may well be court-martialed for a strange interest in foreign sports, which I don't think it will be allowable in Donald Trump's military. But number two, you're no isolationist because you know about things that a lot of Americans don't know about, and it's a world sport, football. Even I have to acknowledge that, although I don't like it terribly much. But there you are. You've impressed us across the board today. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you again for sparing the time to talk to Americas.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, number one, we often hear from journalists, and it's great to hear from journalists and people who have their finger on the pulse of American affairs and all the rest of it. But we hear, I think, not enough from the kind of players behind the scenes who really know what's going on. And we have just heard from someone who very much knows what's going on. And the thing for me that's fascinating is that these people do not regard themselves as isolationists. They don't want to pull back from the world. They don't see that as their role. And that is in conflict, it seems to me, with the way that they're often portrayed.
Yeah, it really didn't feel as though, certainly from that conversation, that he believes that Donald Trump is setting himself up in opposition to Biden. And you kind of think, I guess, about the conversations perhaps they've been having, the conversation that they seemed to have last week about, particularly about the wars and what's going on. It kind of makes you also think about what's unfolding right now and to what extent Joe Biden is making decisions that could be kind of beneficial to Donald Trump in terms of how he deals with this longer term and how there is, or whether there is, any resolution to the war in Ukraine, and then also to the war in the Middle East too. And I mean, the other thing I find so interesting is kind of, I mean, there's so much discussion on social media as ever about this kind of woke, anti-woke. You know, we're not into or up for this way of looking at the world that we think that certainly for the past 4 years has kind of grown with the previous administration. We actually want it to be, as you kind of described it, Justin, like it's all about merit and it's not about who you are. I'd just be really interested in how that actually plays out. Like, it feels that is the thing that feels like it's the thing that the public, or certainly the people who voted for Donald Trump, are most receptive to and want to see in kind of all walks of life, really, not just the military.
I so agree. It wasn't the top. And we kept saying this, didn't we, during the last year or so? Things like trans issues, they're never the top of an agenda when you write a kind of list of things that people are concerned about and will be voting on. But what the Trump administration seems to me to have done is to tap into a kind of sense among a lot of Americans, particularly perhaps Americans who haven't had college degrees and thus been exposed to all the things that are talked about a lot in modern universities when it comes to all of this agenda, that actually regard it as something that holds America back. And they've kind of found a way. We talk sometimes of the culture wars, but it seems to me to be not so much that as a kind of tsunami now, which will bring a load of separate issues together in one huge wave that they think, whether or not they're right, of course, is another question, but they think is actually going to be enormously beneficial to them and that they'll be able to change American society with. So we've just been hearing about the military, and that's a really important part of it, of course. But, you know, much more widely, I'm wondering what happens with big corporations now who've been very much in the forefront of a lot of stuff that is sometimes characterized as woke. What do they do? Do they change the way they are? Do they change their policies? Even the universities, actually. Do they, under a Trump administration, have to change the things that they do and say? And all of these things are kind of, you know, never mind the hard policy decisions about tax and spending and military things and all the rest of it. This kind of culture change, which you're going to see an awful lot of online, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and also actually when you have those conversations about these topics in the way we just did, they do feel very different to how they play out online. You know, if you were watching even, you know, the current situation unfolding in Ukraine and with Russia, if you open up X, or to be honest, any of the social media sites, but I'd say probably X in particular, there's this very binary conversation about it. Either like, you know, Joe Biden is triggering World War III, or the opposite. You know, this is actually this massive strategy and great. This is a really good plan, and this should have happened ages ago. And actually, you know, as is reality, and as I'm sure probably lots of voters felt, what's actually the case kind of sits in between. And when you talk to people, as we just did, you actually, you know, realise that maybe it's not so binary, and it's maybe not so much about constantly being in opposition to one another about things, but saying, hang on, this is just sort of honestly the truth of it, and how do we fix it?
And that's all we got time for today. Do listen on BBC Sounds for more from us. It'll all be coming soon. Bye-bye.
Americast from BBC News.